My name is Jackie Bong. The month of April is always a painful moment for those of us Vietnamese living overseas. It reminds us of the terrible events of April 1975, when Vietnam was lost to the communists from North Vietnam. I have with me today Frank Snepp, an ex-CIA agent who has written extensively about those events. His book, Decent Interval, is widely regarded as a classic of the war. Today, he is going to tell us some things about the fall of Saigon you may not know. He's also going to tell us about a Vietnamese master spy, a secret agent for the Saigon government who almost changed the course of the war. Frank, thank you for being here.
I'm truly honored to be here. You and your late husband, Viet Cong, are remembered by everybody as true heroes of the struggle for democracy in Vietnam. His assassination robbed the country of one of its most important independent voices. And your current husband, my good friend Lacey Wright, served honorably as a Foreign Service officer at the U.S. Embassy while I was there. And he heroically rescued many Vietnamese evacuees on the final days of the war.
Remind us what you did in Vietnam and why you wrote Decent Interval.
I was a senior intelligence analyst for the CIA, responsible for keeping track of the enemy threat in Vietnam. I wrote reports about it, interrogated prisoners and other sources, and often answered directly to the CIA station chief and the ambassador. I did this for about 6 years and spent 5.5 of them in Vietnam itself. I was one of the last CIA officers to be lifted off the roof of the embassy in the last day of the war. My experiences left me with great respect for our Vietnamese allies, and that feeling inspired me to write my memoir, Decent Interval, about the fall of Saigon. I published it soon after I left the agency in 1976. You know, I wanted to remind the American people, Jackie, of our moral connection to our Vietnamese allies and our obligation to help as many of them as possible escape Vietnam even after the communist takeover.
There's one Vietnamese, I understand, who haunts you until today.
Yes, he's one of many. His name was Vo Van Ba. He was a secret agent who worked for the South Vietnamese police and the CIA for more than 10 years. He was planted inside the top communist command for the Saigon area and the Delta, an entity known as the Central Office, or COSVIN. It often operated out of a cave in the mountains of Tay Ninh province, where Vo Van Ba made his home. Whenever the COSVIN leadership, the Communist Command, received directives from Hanoi, Vo Van Ba copied or stole those secrets and gave them to his police and CIA case officers. You know, his actions saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese patriots and American troops over the course of the war.
How did Vo Van Ba become a spy?
He was once a youth organizer for the Viet Minh. He quit the so-called revolution in the early 1950s because of the communist preference for using terror and bloodshed to win hearts and minds. He resettled in Tay Ninh province, became a farmer, and an active member of the Cao Dai sect, a favorite communist target, as you know. The local police learned of his background and persuaded him to work for them as a spy with the objective of infiltrating COSVIN. By 1963, posing as a loyal Viet Cong, he had burrowed his way into the COSVIN support staff, a local party cell, and had gained access to COSVIN secrets. The CIA eventually joined the police in managing the operation.
What is his first big success as a spy?
In early 1968, Vo Van Ba demonstrated just how valuable he was. He provided a 5-day advance warning of the Tet Offensive. This enabled Allied troops to gear up to protect Saigon. His reporting helped save the capital and countless Allied lives. The following year, soon after I arrived in Vietnam, Vo Van Ba confirmed to his case officers that the communists had suffered so many casualties in 1968, they would not be able to launch a major offensive for at least 2 years. This made it possible for President Nixon to launch his Vietnamization policy and to begin withdrawing American troops from South Vietnam. That's how important Vo Van Ba's reporting was in those middle years of the war.
Did you ever meet Vo Van Ba directly?
In early 1971, I met with Vo Van Ba for 3 days to recertify his credibility. I trusted in him. I'd been using his reporting in my analyses, but I was brought in just to make sure he was still trustworthy. I came away from that meeting convinced that he was supremely reliable. In fact, I concluded that having him in play, working against Kosvin, was like having a spy in Hitler's bunker in World War II. He was that good.
Did you continue meeting with him?
Up through the very end of the war, I met with him periodically to clarify his reporting or to pose questions. These were the same things his case officers did all the time. I just brought an analytical perspective to the questioning. Secrets buzzing around in my head I used to sharpen the questions. You know, whenever he showed up for our meetings, they were always at a safe house in Saigon, he would come in disguise, wearing an extravagant wig, huge dark glasses, and a man's Alzheimer that made him look like a woman.
It doesn't sound like James Bond.
Well, in fact, his police and CIA case officers, all of them very, very accomplished spy masters, trained him in all the tricks of the spy trade. The use of disguises, secret radios, the way to hand off secrets so no one would notice. They staged fake terrorist attacks in Tay Ninh and fake anti-government demonstrations and made it appear that he had organized them on behalf of the communists so he could improve his standing with them. To the leaders of Kosvin, the communist command, he looked like a model revolutionary, a perfect terrorist, and they came to trust him.
What did Vo Van Ba look like?
Vo Van Ba's appearance was deceptive. He was an aging guy when I met him. And he always reminded me of a hank of barbed wire. All sharp angles, sharp elbows, a little bent. His skin was rust-colored. His eyes darted constantly as if he was looking for somebody in his surroundings who might be ready to betray him. This man had a photographic memory. He could look at a document and remember every word on it and then recite it verbatim a little while later. It's exactly what you need in a spy. His face was strangely unwrinkled. Imagine pulling a rubber mask over a small oblong artillery shell and pulling it tight. That's the way his face looked. No wrinkles. To me, it was a miracle. I'd been a basket case if I'd been in his position. But Vo Van Ba was an extraordinary man, both in his presence of mind and in terms of his memory.
Did you mention him in your book, Decent Interval?
Yes, I wrote about him, but without giving much detail because so much about that operation was classified when my book was published in late 1977. But Jackie, 2 things have happened since then to make it possible to talk about him more openly. Because of his exploits, Hanoi's own security experts decided after the war to investigate what he had done. They wanted to determine how this one guy had so outsmarted and outmaneuvered Hanoi's own wartime leadership. They pulled up captured documents, they dug into archived prisoner testimony, they put together a profile of Vo Van Ba and his operation, and they began publishing their findings in 2010, really very recently. They concluded he had stolen every one of Kosvin's key planning documents, every major planning paper of the Communist Command from 1965 to the end of the war, including the command's blueprint for undermining the ceasefire and finally capturing Saigon. This research by Hanoi's own security people has recently been supplemented by the writings of a former Vietnamese police officer, Major Nhu Phan, who worked with Vo Van Ba throughout the war. Major Nhu was captured after the fall of Saigon and thrown into a re-education camp, but he now lives in Orange County, right down the road from where we're speaking today. 3 years ago, he published his own account of the Vo Van Ba operation and posted it online. It was recirculated by the BBC. He even wrote about some of my own early meetings with him.
Did Vo Van Ba reporting affect the end of the war?
It did, Jackie, in many crucial ways. In fact, it enabled us to determine a lot about the communist offensive that set up the ceasefire. That was the Easter Offensive. In early 1972, Vo Van Ba provided advance warning of that action, of the Easter Offensive, thus enabling Allied forces to prepare for it. That helped save the country. The following summer, he began reporting on the Paris peace talks between Henry Kissinger and Lê Duc Tho, Hanoi's representative. Kissinger wasn't happy about this. He wanted to keep the negotiations secret from everybody, including the CIA and President Thieu, so there would be no danger of embarrassing leaks. Vo Van Ba exposed what Kissinger was up to.
What? Vo Van Ba was spying on Kissinger?
No, he was picking up information on Kissinger's negotiating strategy from the communists' own field briefings about it, the information Hanoi was sending to its own troops in the South Vietnam. And there was more to come. In early October 1972, the fall, Vo Van Ba handed the CIA station and President Thieu something truly breathtaking. An actual draft of the secret peace agreement that Kissinger had just worked out with Lê Duc Tho. It showed that Kissinger had agreed to let the North Vietnamese keep their forces in the South after a ceasefire, that he'd also promised post-war aid to Hanoi.
So what was President Thieu's response?
When President Thieu read this stuff, he hit the ceiling. He was furious. He demanded changes in the secret agreement. Negotiations broke down. The North Vietnamese objected. Now, during the subsequent Christmas holidays, when everything looked like it was coming to an end at the negotiating table, Christmas holidays, 1972, Nixon responded in his own way. He unleashed a vicious bombing campaign against Hanoi and Haiphong. As you know, Jackie, that brought the North Vietnamese back to the bargaining table. It also caused them to drop a proposal that would have created a coalition government in South Vietnam 60 days after the ceasefire, something that President Thieu didn't want at all. Of course he didn't. So the bombing and Vo Van Ba's reporting actually left Thieu stronger politically going into the ceasefire than he would have been otherwise.
Then the peace agreement took effect?
Yes, the peace agreement occurred just a few days later, in late January 1973. Soon afterwards, Vo Van Ba reported to his case officers that Hanoi had decided not to launch any large-scale military activity for 3 to 5 years. It wasn't because they were going to observe the ceasefire. It was because of the weaknesses of their own troops in South Vietnam. It was also because of Hanoi's growing uncertainty over the reliability of its own principal allies, the Soviets and the Chinese. They were busily trying to improve their own relations with the United States. Often it seemed to Hanoi's disadvantage. They hadn't objected, they hadn't responded, for instance, to the Christmas bombing. So Hanoi wasn't sure just how far it could trust the Soviets and the Chinese.
But the South Vietnamese was facing its own problems, right?
You're absolutely right. Saigon was facing problems with us, the United States. In the next few months, Congress voted to stop all U.S. bombing in Indochina. It also limited President Nixon's ability to wage war on anybody's behalf, including Saigon's. The South Vietnamese were now truly on their own militarily. But during the same period, up through the end of 1973, Soviet and Chinese military aid to Hanoi dropped by 50%. And the North Vietnamese began withdrawing their forces from Cambodia and Laos. Very positive developments. And by early 1974, it looked as though the ceasefire might solidify into something like a lasting, if uneasy, stalemate, with neither side able to gain advantage. But the following summer, 1974, President Nixon resigned under the shadow of Watergate. And that meant all bets were off. Everything changed. A few weeks later, in the fall of 1974, Vo Van Bar reported to his case officers that Hanoi had just adopted a new opportunistic military strategy. The communists now would be looking for any strategic opportunity, that was the phrase the Politburo used, strategic opportunity to launch a general offensive suddenly and to win a quick victory in South Vietnam. According to Vo Van Ba, communist troops in the field were told that this breakthrough might not come until 1976 or even 1979, pretty far down the road. But then, Jackie, the unexpected happened. In late January 1975, communist forces seized Phuc Long province, 80 miles north of Saigon. They didn't get any pushback militarily from the Thieu government or the new Ford administration in Washington. The leadership in Hanoi decided at this point that the road to Saigon was open, and they turned up the military pressure.
What was President Thieu's response?
President Thieu reacted precipitously, then changed his mind and changed his mind again. Enemy spies stole his latest operational plans, thus allowing Hanoi's generals to outguess him. And, Jackie, that made all the difference. By the end of March, in just a month, this is 1975, communist forces had seized the entire northern half of South Vietnam and destroyed half of Saigon's army. Suddenly and shockingly, the end of the war was upon us.
So what did Vo Van Ba say about all this?
During early April, 3 weeks before the end, he reported to his case officers that the communists now meant to seize Saigon as early as possible and would treat all talk of negotiations simply as an opportunity to sow confusion in Saigon and Washington. Logically, that should have prompted the U.S. Embassy in Saigon to begin preparing immediately for possible emergency evacuations. There were, at that time, about 6,000 Americans still in Vietnam. I estimated, at the direction of my superiors, that the United States owed rescue and protection to at least 1 million Vietnamese whose principal family members had once worked for American agencies in the course of the war. 1 million Vietnamese we had to somehow get out of the country. That was the estimate I delivered. But U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin and my own boss, CIA Station Chief Tom Polgar, had been tricked by cynical politicians and diplomats in Saigon. They'd been led to believe that the communists would settle for a negotiated ending to the war. Both men assumed that any visible planning for an evacuation would destabilize conditions in Saigon and lead to an immediate collapse of the government and loss of any chance for a political solution. So, they downplayed and delayed evacuation planning for both Americans and loyal Vietnamese.
Things were terrible all over Vietnam.
Yeah, in mid-April, things went from bad to worse. Cambodia collapsed. Congress rejected the latest aid package for South Vietnam. Saigon's forward defense line, 40 miles north of the city, disintegrated. That was at Xuan Loc. And Thieuy's political rivals began plotting to overthrow him. In view of all of this, Ambassador Martin and my boss, Station Chief Polgar, decided that Thieu had to step down in order to avert a bloodbath and to jumpstart negotiations.
What did you hear from Vo Van Ba?
To nail down Hanoi's plans, I arranged to meet with him directly on April 17th, 2 weeks before the end. I asked him specifically the questions that Martin and Polgar were asking themselves. Would the communists negotiate? Would Thieu's departure dissuade them from moving against Saigon? Ba answered me unequivocally. No, he said to both questions. He also told me that the communists meant to capture Saigon in time to celebrate Ho Chi Minh's birthday there in mid-May. That they would launch their final attack on the city by late April and would bring airstrikes and artillery to bear on Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Now you would think this report would have a big impact. But because Kissinger had just asked the Soviets to intervene with Hanoi, to temper Hanoi's ambitions, Martin and Polgar brushed aside this report from Vo Van Ba. They described it to me as outdated and irrelevant because of Kissinger's entreaties, his approach to the Soviets. But fortunately, the very moment that report from Vo Van Ba reached Washington, Kissinger himself ordered Martin to speed up the departure of all surplus Americans in Saigon so there would be the least possible number to evacuate in an emergency and more room for last-minute Vietnamese evacuees. The U.S. Commander-in-Chief for the Pacific, Admiral Noel Geiler, traveled to Saigon to arrange for a refitting of the embassy grounds so big helicopters from the evacuation fleet offshore could land in the embassy compound if need be. These steps would prove critical to the success of the final helicopter airlift several days later, if success is the right word. Without these preparations, none of us who escaped by helicopter that final day, including 7,000 to 9,000 Vietnamese, would have gotten out as safely and as easily as we did. Vo Van Ba deserves a large part of the credit for that. But Martin and Polgar continued to believe that Thieu's removal would bring about peace talks and make an evacuation unnecessary. On April 21st, 8 days before the end, President Thieu resigned under U.S. pressure. 4 days later, I was assigned to be his personal driver as part of a CIA operation to smuggle him to Tan Son Nhut Air Base so he could catch a secret flight out of the country. But just as Vo Van Ba had warned, his departure changed nothing. 4 days later, on April 29th, Communist forces moved against Saigon, just as Vo Van Ba had predicted, amidst a blaze of firepower. U.S. evacuation helicopters raced to the rescue of imperiled Americans and Vietnamese in Saigon, but not soon enough. The final emergency airlift degenerated into a case of every man, woman, and child for themselves.
What was it like to conduct that operation?
Jackie, it was chaos on the final day, extremely dangerous because chaos brings uncertainty at every turn. Your current husband, Lacey Wright, rescued Vietnamese from around the city, took them to barges on the waterfront, and there was disorganization there. Martin had not wanted the barges to be used. He thought it might cause panic in the city. Lacey finally made his way back to the embassy, and he had to basically be drawn or pulled into the embassy compound because there were so many Vietnamese surrounding it. Throughout that final day, my own colleagues and I pulled countless Vietnamese over the walls of the embassy. We were playing God. We would reach over, grab the hands of a child, and pull that child up and over the wall, away from its parents, leaving them never to be rejoined. It was one of the most horrible situations I've ever gone through. In the CIA operations room, people were calling in, Vietnamese were calling in over the CIA's Diamond Network, calling for help. I'm Mr. Ba, please come and get me. I'm at so-and-so location, this location. And we would dispatch helicopters to try to pick them up. But we too often missed the pickup, and the Vietnamese were left behind. They were kept screaming over the radios for help. And even to this day, I can hear their voices in my nightmares. I call them soundmares. The pleadings of Vietnamese who desperately wanted to get out. Yeah, it was horrible that day. I don't think anybody who lived through it will ever get over it. During the chaos of that final afternoon, Polgar confessed to me that he and the ambassador had been wrong about enemy intentions, and that Vo Van Ba had been right all along.
So what happened to Vo Van Ba?
During the final weeks of the war, Jackie, 2 CIA employees who had been captured by the enemy were forced under torture to reveal Ba's identity, or at least his existence, according to Hanoi's own later public account. Then shortly after the fall of Saigon, Communist security cadre tracked Ba down at his home in Tay Ninh. They threw him into a local cell to await execution. At some point, while his guards were looking the other way, Vo Van Ba hung himself by his belt, according to Hanoi's own later reports. His wife was allowed to remain free, but his son was thrown into a re-education camp where he languished for many years. Major Nu Phan, the police officer who had worked with Vo Van Ba, says it's no surprise to him the old spy committed suicide. He says that Vo Van Ba remarked, just before the fall of Saigon, that he would rather die by his own hand than live in a country controlled by the communists. That is the story of Vo Van Ba, one of the great unsung heroes of the nationalist cause in Vietnam. All Vietnamese patriots, anywhere they are, should be proud of what he did for them.